Hi, my name is Eric Brown. I want to thank you all for joining us today at Hudson Institute. With the recent wrap-up of the ASEAN Summit in Singapore and the APEC meeting in Papua New Guinea, we're here today to discuss the unfolding U.S.-PRC rivalry and what it means for Southeast Asia. President Obama's pivot to Asia made a heck of a lot of good sense, but it faced a failure to launch due to steep cuts in defense spending, and while the Trans-Pacific Partnership languished with seemingly nothing to replace it. Now, something like Obama's strategic plan has gotten a boost in the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which was announced last year amidst rising doubts in Asia about America's staying power. Vice President Pence made clear this past week in Asia that a secure, prosperous, and sovereign Southeast Asia is crucial to America's core interests, including the preservation of the general peace in Asia. The U.S., in concert with allies Japan and Australia and other free nations, has sought to oppose PRC's expansionism, unrolling a suite of new economic and other diplomatic initiatives, not just security initiatives, to deepen our partnership with those ASEAN countries that don't want to become PRC dependencies. A sizable part of Southeast Asia has in fact grown wary of PRC's intentions. Even so, ASEAN as a body has insisted on remaining neutral and on staying clear of the now intensifying US-PRC rivalry. ASEAN was of course founded some 50 years ago to help Southeast Asia maintain its sovereignty, to recover from war and prevent what Singapore's Foreign Minister S. Rajaratnam described back then as the balkanization of Southeast Asia under the pressure of the rivalries of the Cold War era. At the time, ASEAN's neutrality arguably made a lot of sense, and it did soon prove to be a productive policy. But one question we want to discuss today is whether ASEAN's diplomatic fence-sitting is still the better response in our new era of strategic competition for nations that want, in fact, to unlock their full economic potential and to maintain their security and sovereignty in the 21st century. I'm grateful to be joined today with three top foreign policy strategists who I myself deeply respect and admire. We have, in no particular order, Dr. Patrick Cronin from the Center for New American Security, who is fresh off a wild tour of Southeast Asia, and we're very happy that he could join us today. Dr. Amy Searight, who's Senior Advisor and Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 2014 to 2016, Amy served as our Republic's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia. We also have my good colleague, Dr. John Lee. Before rejoining Hudson Institute this past year as a non-resident senior fellow, John had served as National Security Advisor to Australia's Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. We'll start with John.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for giving up your time. There was a comment last week from the Singaporean Prime Minister, Lee, which is perfectly timed for this panel. And he said the following: we all agree that empire and aggression has no place in the Indo-Pacific. But he also delivered this warning. If you are friends with two countries which are on different sides, sometimes it is possible to get along with both. Sometimes it's more awkward when you try to get along with both. I think it's very desirable for us not to take sides, but the circumstances may come when ASEAN may have to choose one or the other. I'm hoping that it's not coming soon. When I left government in April, I spent the next month or so doing a bit of a mini tour in my own name and speaking my own voice to a number of Southeast Asian countries, speaking to a lot of the political figures, the bureaucratic figures, but also a lot of political figures in most of the maritime countries in Southeast Asia. And I made 3 points to them. First, Southeast Asian nations, and I said this as a friend, Southeast Asian nations must live in a world they find themselves, and it is time for Southeast Asian nations to choose. But it is not an inherent choice between two countries, the United States or China. It is a choice between two different worldviews, and more specifically, a choice between two different sets of principles which should rule and govern the region. The second point I made to them was, second, as an organisation which seeks diplomatic centrality, ASEAN centrality will be lost. Its relevance will decline if it continues to remain silent on alternative sets of principles with which it chooses to endorse and engage. And the third point, if ASEAN does not choose between principles, ASEAN will itself begin to fracture to the point where several of its own members will begin to abandon ASEAN centrality in substance and pay minimal lip service to ASEAN centrality. Now, as you can imagine, a minority of my interlocutors agreed with me, but most were in strong disagreement. So I thought I should spend the next 10 minutes in this forum here making a case for why I offered those 3 points to my colleagues in Southeast Asia. The first about choosing between principles. I was amazed at the extent to which many Southeast Asian political officials I spoke to were uncomfortable with the Australian, Japanese and American notions of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, there are differences between what these countries mean by the free and open Indo-Pacific, but in my view, essentially, it's a reaffirmation of security and economic principles which have evolved after the Second World War, especially as they relate to freedom of navigation and a global commons such as sea, air, and cyberspace, and the way nations conduct their economic affairs. With respect to economic affairs, the free part includes freedom from economic coercion and the use of debt to acquire leverage over another country's decision-making process. In short, economic relations in this free and open Indo-Pacific should not entail the diminishing of a country's sovereignty. For me, that is the difference between, for example, Donald Trump's tariffs, which have their good and bad points in my view, and what China does. Donald Trump claims he wants a better deal for America, but what does that mean? Let's assume he's seeking to change what he perceives to be illegal or unfair Chinese behaviour, so intellectual property theft, widespread and distorting subsidies, SOEs, etc. Now, we may question, what the real motivations are, but those are the stated motivations. In contrast, China has used economics to punish sovereign decisions made by countries in the region, such as South Korea's deployment of the THAAD missile defense system. It has created unsustainable debt burdens on countries, only to subsequently force those countries into ceding control over assets with potential military significance, and Pakistan and Sri Lanka are the 2 examples. In my view, there is a world of difference between even what the harshest interpretation of what the Trump administration is trying to do, or what America first means, and what China has been doing for a period of time. The open part of the free and open Indo-Pacific is about ensuring economic agreements that are transparently and fairly negotiated and which accord with international rules and laws. They should not be closed agreements which entrench the size and power imbalance between China and other countries. Now, Southeast Asian countries that I've spoken to, the officials, they don't actually disagree with my analysis. They agree with what I think China is trying to do. They also, in principle, support the tenets of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Yet, from my discussions with political officials, particularly with the exception of Vietnam and perhaps Thailand and Indonesia, they have largely refused to openly support the articulation of these principles, even though these are principles which fundamentally protect their interest as small and weaker states. Southeast Asian nations cannot even bring themselves to mention, for example, the 2016 arbitration decision, which largely went in favour of the Philippines and against China in the South, regarding the South China Sea. Now, they take this line, of course, because they don't want to provoke and anger China, and they do this because they say they are committed to a cost-free approach. Now, the reality that I countered with is that there is no such thing as a cost-free approach. I do not consider what China has managed to achieve and entrench in the South China Sea cost-free to these nations. Cambodia and Laos have become virtual client states of China's. And I have been in meetings with political officials when I was in government with Cambodia and Laos, where essentially what they did was directly dictated to by the Chinese, literally on the spot. Cambodia and Laos have offered Chinese a veto over many of the foreign policy decisions, and once again, to me, this is hardly a cost-free approach. Moreover, as Southeast Asian countries formally sit on the fence, although behind the scenes they're not, but as they formally sit on the fence, things are not standing still. The ground is shifting to their disadvantage, especially in the South China Sea. So in my mind, this wait-and-see approach, or this so-called small target approach, is actually a guaranteed strategy for them to lose. Now, if you remember, at the broadest level, the grand strategy of pretty much all Southeast Asian countries is to prevent the emergence of an Asian hegemon in a region which they would view as structurally oppressive and dangerous. So I grant that there are key Southeast Asian countries working hard behind the scenes to support the US and allied countries strategic and militarily, but their refusal to overtly choose and support a set of principles gives China diplomatic cover to do what it does. The other side of the coin is that support for the principles of a free and open Indo-Pacific will make it easier diplomatically for the US and allies to give meat to the bones of this free and open Indo-Pacific concept. Now, second, let me get to why ASEAN and not just individual countries, in my view, need to openly engage with the principles of a free and open Indo-Pacific. They should want to do so if they want to maintain their diplomatic relevance and centrality. Now, I know their reluctance comes down to ASEAN's long-time preference for the principles of neutrality and inclusiveness. As Eric mentioned, this has served them well in the past, but neutrality and inclusiveness only works if there are no major disagreements between great powers and between ASEAN states, and when major powers are able to find common ground. Now, I think we can agree this is not what the Indo-Pacific increasingly looks like. It is not where the Indo-Pacific is headed. China wants to very clearly change the strategic and territorial order in the region. Now, you can argue that's China's right to try to do so, but the fact remains that it is not in the interest of Southeast Asian nations or the large powers, the US, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. For the moment, the United States, Japan, and Australia, I think, will pay lip service to ASEAN centrality. I note that in the ASEAN-Australia summit in March this year, for example, I counted in my Prime Minister's speech, and I was serving government at the time, he said the phrase, "We believe in ASEAN centrality," no less than 17 times. So Australia will pay lip service to ASEAN centrality, and they have resisted criticising ASEAN's management of the South China Sea issues beyond expressing the preference that a code of conduct is negotiated between ASEAN and China, and that code be consistent with international law and binding on all sides. Over time, I think these countries, and probably India, will become less and less sympathetic to the passive approach by ASEAN and many of its member states. Refusing to focus on points of disagreement with China will not protect Southeast Asia, but more to the point, it will not serve the interests of the United States, Australia, and Japan. Declining to take a strong stand and increase at least diplomatic cost to China, which is something ASEAN can do, has consequences when China is pushing, challenging, and changing external rules and the strategic environment. Now, what happens in the South China Sea is not only a matter for ASEAN countries and for China. I've made the argument to my ASEAN counterparts that only 5 out of 10 ASEAN member states are actually claimants in the South China Sea. So I think Southeast Asian countries do need to dispense with the conceit that the South China Sea is a Southeast Asian issue primarily. I have sat in ASEAN summits where only the leaders or ministers of the United States, Japan, and Australia and India even raise illegal Chinese behaviour in the South China Sea. And yet we are told that the East Asia Summit, for example, is a preeminent forum in the region to raise concerns, strategic concerns amongst ourselves. The ASEAN states have sat silent and remain non-judgmental. I do not think these other countries will tolerate this for too much longer because too much is changing. Either ASEAN raises the diplomatic cost for China or it gives diplomatic cover to China. If it chooses the latter, to give diplomatic cover, then ASEAN increasingly, and I don't mean this in a threatening way, I just mean this in a matter-of-fact way, becomes part of the problem rather than part of the solution for other powers. This will structurally, I think, lead other powers to put less emphasis on ASEAN over time. And eventually, without the backing by the United States and other powers for ASEAN diplomatic centrality actually has no meaning for ASEAN. For example, groupings such as the Quad may well become a better diplomatic platform to talk about these issues over time for these countries. That's one speculation. Now, finally, this brings me to internal ASEAN division. I cannot see Vietnam tolerating ASEAN's current diplomatic playbook for too much longer. Indonesia seems to me is growing impatient. I think a post-Duterte Philippines will grow impatient. Other diplomatic vehicles will become increasingly useful for these countries, meaning ASEAN will become less relevant even to some ASEAN members. Now, for ASEAN, this unity is deaf, but this unity for any organisation seeking centrality is certainly going to be fatal. In ASEAN's case, neutrality is just as bad when there are competing worldviews and things are shifting too quickly and too much is at stake. Finally, let me just highlight a final irrationality of a common Southeast Asian perspective. As Eric mentioned, I served in the government as National Security Advisor to the Foreign Minister for 2 years, one under the Obama administration and one under the Trump administration. Under Obama, Southeast Asian nations, fairly or unfairly, complain consistently that Obama's pivot to Asia was ineffective, largely because the White House played too nice to China and did not seem like it wanted to compete with China. Under Trump, these same states now say the administration's laying down the gauntlet to China is too provocative and too destabilising, so they can't have it both ways. These irrationalities will not serve their interests, and I think it is time for them to choose a set of principles. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Amy.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to make a lot of similar points to John. I agree with most of what he said, although I took the question slightly differently. You know, at a time when clearly U.S.-China strategic rivalry is intensifying, and both countries over recent years have been sharpening the differences between their vision for Asia. You know, we have Xi Jinping in 2014 talking about a new Asia security concept that is going to be Asia for Asians. And now you have the free and open Indo-Pacific put forth by President Trump and Vice President Pence over the weekend that lays out a very different vision. So there is, you know, these two starkly different visions, and the long-standing concern within Southeast Asia that countries will be forced to choose between the United States and China is really sort of at an all-time high. The free and open Indo-Pacific has been defined in many ways as a counter to China's Belton Road initiative. And so that has sort of, you know, ramped up this anxiety. So the question is, the question that I understood we were wanting to answer today is, should countries in Southeast Asia be forced to choose? And my answer overall is a qualified no, although I'll have an exception at the end when it comes to thinking about ASEAN as a collective unit. But in terms of Southeast Asian countries, the first point to make is it's very clear that Southeast countries do not want to be forced to choose. They've made this very clear. They want strong economic and diplomatic ties with both China and the United States. And in pretty much all cases, certainly most cases, they want very strong security ties to the United States. They want a strong strategic presence of the United States in the region to help counter balance against China, but they don't want to give up the opportunities that come with very strong economic linkages to China. So they don't want to be forced to choose. It's certainly in an open sense. Now, many, in fact, do choose by their actions, but not their diplomatic stances. So, for example, Singapore is not a treaty ally with the United States, tries to play an even hand in many of its diplomatic statements and gestures, and yet Singapore anchors a very important U.S. presence in the region in a variety of ways, air and naval assets, is a very strong security partner with the United States. Of course, we have a free trade agreement with Singapore. And the diplomatic positions that Singapore takes usually are very much in line, broadly speaking, with the interests of the United States in maintaining a strong United States presence in the region. Then, of course, we have two treaty allies in Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Thailand. Both countries, there's been growing concern about increased hedging by both with China, growing closeness, even in some security affairs with cooperation with China. And yet, ultimately, they continue to provide access, a very important access to American forces, have very strong mill-to-mill ties with the United States, and have a variety of cooperation in a broad range of areas that still remains very strong. And then you have countries like Malaysia. It's interesting that Prime Minister Mahathir is now back in power. When he was in power 20 years ago, he rhetorically was not a friend of the United States. But it was under his leadership, actually, that U.S.-Malaysia mill-to-mill relations grew very strong. There's a lot of ship visits, a lot of defense cooperation we have with Malaysia, a lot of intel sharing on the intelligence side that's very important. So, again, Malaysia, through its actions, through the actual cooperation that it supports with the United States, is a very important partner in the region, even if diplomatically it does not always trumpet very pro-U.S. views and sometimes seems very accommodating to China. So the first point I wanted to make is Southeast Asian countries do not want to be forced to choose. The second point is that China is very good at trying to create false binary choices that try to force countries to choose by creating a sort of dichotomous set of choices, narrowing down the field of options and saying to countries, either through broad kind of narratives or sometimes in specific instances, trying to create this sense that countries have to choose. Ambassador Bilahari Kosakan has made this point very eloquently, I think, and I think we see so many examples of that around the region and even with the United States. And to point to just two examples of this is the narrative that Beijing has long been pushing, that the United States is part of the past, China is part of the future, so get on board with the future, or the line that if you have close ties with Washington, you will not be able to have close economic ties with Beijing. So trying to create this choice and trying to force countries to choose. This is out of China's playbook. So I think it's very dangerous, frankly, to follow that playbook and reinforce the idea that there are these sharp choices that countries must choose, because it actually, in a sense, reinforces this broader kind of strategic choice that China is trying to get across. For many of these countries, hedging between these two powers and other regional players is a really attractive and reasonable option. And I don't think hedging, for the most part, is necessarily problematic, as long as countries that are hedging do two things. First, if they stand up for their own interests and make decisions that are good decisions, that are informed, that are transparent, that will lead to good outcomes for the country. In other words, not accept Chinese bribes to accept a financing package from China that will lead to unsustainable debt. But as long as they're making good informed decisions, or transparent with their publics, I think it's okay to hedge. And secondly, if they are standing firm on key principles and norms, such as the rule of law, non-coercion, non-use of force to settle disputes, the kind of principles and norms that uphold the current rules-based order in the region that benefits all the countries in the region. If they're standing up for these principles, then that's also, that's not problematic for the United States, I think. And so to reinforce what John was saying, this really should be framed as a choice, not between the United States and China. It should not be framed as a choice even between the Chinese vision of the future and the American vision of the future. It really should just be a choice framed by what principles and norms do you want to live by? What principles and norms are good for the region and do you want to stand up for? The third point I want to make is it may be a mistake for US policymakers to force countries to choose between the United States and China, because we may not like all of the choices that countries make. A classic example of this is the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, when the United States, under the Obama administration, tried to force its key allies and partners in Europe and Asia not to join with China to create this new investment bank, based on concerns it had about the way the bank would be governed, whether it would support certain kinds of Chinese policies, such as the Belton Road. Ultimately, the United States really only succeeded in getting Japan to abstain from the AIIB, and many other countries in Europe and Australia and elsewhere joined. And not only did they join, but they actually worked very closely with China to restructure the governance of the bank so that now it looks very much, it has higher standards in the governance structure than most regional development banks and the World Bank do today. And it actually acts very much as a bread and butter development bank. So I think it's a very risky strategy to go around the region when China does have a lot to offer and try to force countries to walk away from those offers and side with the United States. And the Belton Road Initiative is another example where countries, although there are some growing concerns about certain Belton Road aspects, they welcome the opportunity to get funding for infrastructure projects. And even Japan, with the recent visit by Prime Minister Abe to Beijing, has signaled a willingness to collaborate with China on some Belton Road projects, although of course they are going to insist on transparency and responsible lending and various features that would lead to quality infrastructure. But again, it's a dangerous game, I think, to try to force countries to choose or come out against the Belton Road. Now, the United States has taken some very positive steps, including steps that Vice President Pence reinforced or elaborated on when he was just out in the region. Steps that include expanding the financing for this restructured OPIC under the BUILD Act that passed by Congress, to support more private sector with some U.S. government financing for infrastructure projects. Also, the announcement that the bilateral arrangement between the United States and Japan to work together with some development financing has now been expanded to a trilateral effort along with Australia. That's very positive. I think it's very promising. I think it would have been very helpful if by now some specific projects could be announced either bilaterally with the United States and Japan or trilaterally with Australia, because I think specific projects would be a much more concrete manifestation of the idea that these countries are coming together under one set of principles around infrastructure and working together. But nevertheless, it's a positive development. And yet, so together, these various initiatives, I think, do reinforce an unfolding narrative in the region about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is there are many pitfalls. Countries in the region are looking at other countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan and elsewhere, and leaders like Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia are taking a second look and walking back from more problematic projects with China. There is a lot of scrutiny in other countries, in Indonesia and the Philippines and Myanmar and elsewhere. So this is an important conversation that the region is having internally within countries and more broadly, and these kinds of steps are helpful to advance that kind of discussion. So on the margins, all of these efforts are very helpful. But let's be honest, I mean, the steps that the United States, the Trump administration is taking are no counter to the massive financial resources that China is willing to put into the Belt and Road. So we don't want to get into a competition where we look at dollar for dollar who is putting more into this and ask countries to choose. And the biggest point to make here is that what countries really want in the region is a positive economic agenda that has trade at the center. For Southeast Asia, security is economics and trade is paramount. And walking away from TPP was the single most destructive thing I think that the Trump administration has done, has really undercut, I think, a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, because it has not replaced it with a very compelling alternative. The offer to negotiate bilateral trade agreements that seem designed to erase bilateral trade deficits with the United States is not an appealing offer for most countries in the region, and I think it critically undercuts the appeal of the broader free and open Indo-Pacific. finally, turning to ASEAN, because I've been talking about Southeast Asian countries as Southeast Asian countries, which is different from ASEAN. ASEAN is a collective organization that was founded over 50 years ago to promote a more sort of collective view in the region and to maintain a sense that these smaller countries have some independence from larger powers and can somewhat drive their own destiny. Here, I completely agree with John that that ASEAN should look within itself and find ways to tackle their internal divisions, to speak more with one voice, and to find a way to, again, not choose sides between the United States and China, but to take a stand for the kinds of principles and order that it wants to live in the future. You know, the classic ASEAN balancing is to agree, as it did, agree to hold a maritime security exercise with China in the South China Sea, which it's just held last month, and then agree that next year it will hold a maritime security exercise with the United States in China and in the South China Sea. And that kind of balancing of the United States and China and other partners is what ASEAN does, and that's fine. But when ASEAN allows itself to be divided and pressured, some countries pressured by China to not come to the table with a unified position, to pull back from any consensus on key issues like the South China Sea, that is deeply harmful to ASEAN and ASEAN's collective interests. I do think ASEAN centrality is going to, in lip service, as John said, is going to remain for some time. ASEAN will continue to be the convener of the region, the sort of event planner for all of these major summits for some time to come. And Vice President Pence and others, Jim Mattis and Pompeo, have gone out of their way to say that ASEAN centrality is a central part of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But it does risk becoming more and more irrelevant as a diplomatic and strategic player if it does not step up and speak more clearly with one voice. And I just want to end with two examples that I think show the concern and possibly a way forward. The first is the way that ASEAN is engaged in the South China Sea Code of Conduct negotiations is deeply problematic because from the get-go, ASEAN conceded a key negotiating position to China by allowing its positions to be divided into 10 countries plus China rather than having a unified ASEAN position. So in this single draft that emerged in August that has all of the positions, the ASEAN countries and China included in one draft, has all 10 countries and their positions spelled out, rather than ASEAN meeting as a group, coming up with an ASEAN position, and then going to the table with China. This is the kind of direction that ASEAN has been headed in, allowing China to deal with the countries as 10 countries rather than as one body, and it's deeply problematic. It really dilutes the position of ASEAN in these negotiations. But secondly, I think a really interesting example of perhaps how to deal with China emerged over the weekend, which was that, you know, in the APEC meeting at Papua New Guinea, the Papua New Guinean foreign minister, who was the chairman of the conference and was in charge of putting together the draft joint statement that all the countries would agree to, you know, the Chinese diplomatic officials present were barging into his office to insist on making their position known, to change some of the text in the chair statement. And they were summarily kicked out of the office, sort of banished from the foreign ministry's office, because the foreign minister said he wanted to protect his impartiality as the chairman of APEC. I think that is a really great, and Papua New Guinea is very close to China, receives a lot of development assistance from China, has a lot of economic ties with China. I think that's a very positive example for some ASEAN countries to look at when they are negotiating these joint declarations and joint texts, to not be interfered with by bullying from China. I'll end there.
Great. Patrick.
Well, Eric, thank you very much, and some great comments from John and Amy. I hope my voice will carry on through this program, and I apologize in advance if it fails. I've just returned from half a dozen Southeast Asian countries, so I look at this subject as dividing the two questions, really. One of them is treating Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian countries with the complexity, the diversity, and the respect they deserve. That's worth doing for the United States. We have tremendous opportunities in terms of economic gains, in terms of security gains, in terms of diplomacy that we can make with these countries even before you think about China. And then there's the second question about the US-China rivalry. This is a global, not just a regional competition, and it's certainly not just a Southeast Asian competition. So I want to separate these two in some ways. Now, as I start thinking about this, hitting on the point again from a Southeast Asian perspective, if I can generalize, from my discussions at least, there is a real fear that there's an economic military tsunami that would result of major power confrontation leading to conflict, whether from trade war or Cold War or hot war. And they want China's money, as has been pointed out, and yet increasingly, I mean, the last couple of years, they are suspicious of China. The backlash of China is real, and it's felt acutely. It doesn't stop them from wanting the money of China. Easy money is easy money, but they really are looking for a balance. And that's really what they want, insist on. They want a balance between the United States and China. They don't want the U.S. retreating. They don't want us instigating a conflict. But they're uncertain about America's commitment. They're uncertain about America's staying power, as you pointed out at the beginning, Eric. And this is why it's so important, I think, for the Vice President to have been an effective messenger of America's commitment to this region, not just to Southeast Asia, obviously, but the Indo-Asia Pacific and in APEC. But the U.S.-China rivalry is, something that does require the kind of full-throated response that I think the Vice President gave here recently at the Hudson Institute. So I think that's an entirely appropriate narrative for the United States to be speaking, frankly, especially in the United States. Because in the United States, our problem is we don't take this seriously enough in terms of our actions, in terms of how we are competing. But in Southeast Asia, where they're so hypersensitive to these issues, it can be an overreaction or sound like an overreaction. Because they know it, they feel it every minute. They're very much aware of it. They want us to make sure that we're treating them on their own terms and not as a prism through which to fight a U.S.-China rivalry. So appreciating that difference is the first part of wisdom of understanding we need both narratives. We need a softer narrative for Southeast Asia, and we need a harder narrative for China in terms of being serious and being taken serious. Now, that China narrative we heard from the Vice President last month, about the predatory economics of China. And I saw this in Kuala Lumpur, where I was my last visit. And of course, Prime Minister Mahathir has been, at 93, the most outspoken of Southeast Asian leaders, perhaps, about the predatory economics that are being felt by China's coercive economics. China doesn't want to just invest, they want to be their boss. They want to bring the whole baggage of Chinese conditions. They claim there are no conditions, but that's pshaw. I mean, these are the most conditional of conditions in terms of really wanting to dominate. Xi Jinping cries out against American protectionism, although he didn't say America by name. And yet a state-owned and state-led capitalism model is protectionism by definition. So the United States is way behind on protectionism. If we want to be protectionist, when you start to compare this, it doesn't equate. So yes, of course the United States should be pushing back hard on this ridiculous narrative coming out of China. The diplomatic arm twisting, the inducements, the intimidation, the interference. I mean, showering right now today, President Duterte with gifts, looking for concessions, is going to be a very interesting thing to watch. And yet on the ground in Philippines and Manila, tremendous support for the United States. We are, brothers and sisters with the Filipinos. We have such a ties. Just visit the American Military Cemetery in Manila, and you'll see those ties run deep. The economic ties, the education ties, people to people, religion, it's very deep indeed. And yet here you have China threatening South China Sea littoral states, essentially saying, if you increase your defense capabilities, you will pay a price. This is the intimidating message that they've let out. In the Code of Conduct draft, building on Amy's points of concern about Asean negotiating, losing leverage, the latest draft from China essentially would give China a veto over the ability to exercise. So Vietnam couldn't exercise with the United States or with Japan or with Australia, and because China could veto it. They couldn't also do exploration rights, which basically means if you can't use a multinational company's ship from the United States or Europe or elsewhere, and you're in Southeast Asia, only China can do that. So you're basically ceding all of the rights to China. That sounds a lot like hegemony to me. So every time the Chinese swear that there's not going to be a hegemon, they would never be hegemonic, they are already acting like a hegemon. All right? And the region understands that. We don't actually need to say that as loudly as I'm saying it here in the United States. We need to say it louder in the United States because we don't seem to get that message. But in Southeast Asia, they get it. But they have to live with these people. Consider even the Cambodian ambassador who said, look, we live next to China. So therefore, seduction is more attractive than destruction. When you're dealing with, they need diplomacy. They have to be clever about this. But they rely on the United States to stand up and be a big power and take on some of these arguments. Same thing with the gray zone salami slicing in terms of their missile buildup. What Admiral Phil Davidson, the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, said that China had replaced a Great Wall of Sand with a Great Wall of SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, because they're using missiles to essentially deter the United States or threaten to deter the United States from entering the second island chain. They've been using political and economic influence to great tune. Read John Lee's excellent editorial today on the influence economically that China's put even in Papua New Guinea. So the third island chain is at risk, essentially, by this economic influence. And that's why it was so good to see the United States and Australia and others, Japan, go in and provide economic assistance, to provide electricity, not just for 15% of the population, but for up to 70% of the population in the coming years, and to build also a military presence, a naval presence. I think the point that I want to make, though, and pivot here, is that, okay, so we're going to take on, we should be taking on, the U.S. should be taking on, along with allies, China's excesses and assertiveness. But for Southeast Asia, at the end of the day, we have to, as Amy said, have to have a positive message about their future and about why we are committed to their future. And it's not their future as a means for us to get to China. It's their future as a means for us to both have better, brighter, prosperous, more secure tomorrows. That's the main message I really want to say. And that's why I wrote in Foreign Policy last week that the message is really for the United States are no retreat. No, we want a very strong engagement in the world and this region. We want no war, trade, cold or hot. The trade confrontation and conflict, yes, I want more competition. I'm not afraid of shying away. We should be direct about the problems. But we don't intend for that to lead. We should not intend for that to lead to a trade war. We have a political objective. The president, I believe, has a political objective of using pressure to get to better agreements. And if not to get to a better agreement, then to manage down an unfair competition. Now, we have to, though, get yes to the positive agenda. And that has to be founded on, I think, 4 basic pillars, slightly different from the ones the vice president laid out. The rule of law. So the freedom of navigation operations that we see are indeed an essential part of expressing what only the United States, frankly, can do well because of its maritime power. And that is to ensure that the international community has a supporter who will go into harm's way and say this is an excessive claim on international law. So flying and sailing and operating where international law permits is something the U.S. can do. But it's not enough for us to do it. We need collective support, right? We need and we want the Australians and the Japanese and the Europeans and others to be doing this. And the more ships in the water, the better, frankly, to do this. And that's what we've seen lately, and that's a very good thing. We also don't want these creeping assertions of sovereignty, as we've seen in the Code of Conduct draft, be imposed, like a domestic law of China, imposed on weaker Southeast Asian countries. This is why the Xinjiang detention is such a warning sign for the region. If China were to export its domestic policy, what would it mean? And yet just this weekend, they were lecturing the Europeans that because of their lassitude on dealing with terrorism and jihadism in Europe, they should look to China's model of detention camps in Xinjiang. Okay? No, we reject that. We reject that. And we should reject that, and there's nothing wrong with that. And when I think about the largest regional democracy, Indonesia alone, this should be part of the democracy club. We want a moderate, Muslim majority, Indonesia, as a democracy. We certainly don't want it as some radical autocracy. We want it to be prosperous. We want to see that middle class grow and that opportunity engage with American businesses. And what opportunities for American business? Oh, we are so far behind, but we have such opportunity. And I talked to businessman after businessman about the opportunities there, and I'm very excited about it. And as with Amy, I just wish we had seen more specifics, at this point, right? Because we know they're there. They're knocking at the door. So that's the second pillar of leading to the sustainable economic development here, of just finding ways to enhance our engagement economically in high technology and human capacity and so many other ways that we can talk about. And then thirdly, inclusive diplomacy. That means engaging the ASEAN-led institutions, lip service, whatever we want to call it. ASEAN countries overall have to feel like the US-China rivalry and all the major power issues can be at least dealt with and talked about in those institutions, even though they know they're not sufficient. And the ASEAN member countries are happy to work trilaterally and many-laterally on issues to make effective cooperation, such as counterterrorism or on maritime patrols, because they know they need effective results. They're pragmatic in that way. But we also need to keep engaging the Chinese, and I think the Trump administration is carrying forward on this, both in terms of the recent resumption of the diplomatic and security dialogue, even the economic contretemps at Port Moresby over the dueling visions of Chinese and American trade policy, you could see really as pre-positioning for the G20 summit. The Chinese have made it very clear that they're only looking at President Trump. They're not looking at anyone else. That's fine. Then we'll give them messages along the way, and so that President Trump can go in with a stronger hand rather than have to go in with a weak hand. The Chinese think that the United States is weak and is going to have to buckle. So it's very important for the United States to be tough and to hang tough, even if others are worried about that. Again, not a message that you want to take to the Southeast Asians and have them have a referendum on it, but a message that we need to know back here about that need for toughness. Now, all of this is undergirded, though, by the fourth pillar of what we need, and that's the security cooperation and our own security strength. I mean, we need a maritime domain awareness sort of regional network, and we can build on the sort of information surveillance reconnaissance support that we've been providing. We can create interoperability through even exercises for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. They provide the same kind of professional interoperability that you're going to need for larger contingencies. We can create more capacity in these countries, in coast guards, in navies, in air forces, and so on. But all of that still has to be backed by our own strong defense, our own strong economic policies, and it's really, that's ultimately what every country is relying upon. Is if we're going to be strong, independent, sovereign nations, it has to start with us to make sure we're strong. But not be afraid to go into a region and speak to them on their terms, and yet speak to a China on its terms. It seems to me it's a fine duality to accept that complexity, that we live in a world where we have more than one narrative. So Eric, I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all. It's really helpful. We have a very large audience here today, and I know that many of you have questions, so I'd like to open this up for Q&A. We have one person with a microphone. When that microphone comes around to you, if you can identify yourself and your affiliation for the record, that would be fantastic. Miss, in the front row here. Thank you.
Thank you for the great discussion. Eunjung Cho with the Voice of America. I'd like to respectfully move the map up north a little bit and ask about U.S.-China rivalry on North Korea. How is the latest this year's intensifying trade tensions impacting North Korea policy, especially Chinese sanctions implementations? And how did the recent diplomatic strategic dialogue impact Chinese position on North Korea? And do you think North Korea is one issue that maybe U.S. and China can cooperate on? Thank you.
Patrick, you want to?
Well, thank you for those questions. And excuse me, my voice. I think the Chinese have at least strenuously asserted that they continue to fully implement all relevant sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council resolutions, that begs the question as to what sanctions they consider maybe to be irrelevant. I think there's no doubt that the Chinese have loosened the reins on enforcement of sanctions in the past couple of months, since especially the Trump-Kim summit seemed to provide a milestone of cooperation with North Korea. And the United States has been sending mixed messages. At times, it sent some softer messages about North Korea than other times. More recently, it's been back on the hustings of we need to fully enforce sanctions, and the Vice President certainly has reinforced that message. But stepping back from the tactics of whether China is going to fully enforce sanctions or not, or slightly relax sanctions, we have a bigger problem with North Korea than the administration of sanctions. We have to determine in the coming weeks, really, whether this diplomacy can go forward. And that's a much bigger question than just the current push for sanctions. North Korea is holding back on what was expected from both the Blue House and the White House with respect to taking serious steps toward denuclearization. If Kim Jong-un is not able or not willing to take those significant steps toward denuclearization, I think this diplomacy ends much sooner than people expected. I would hope and I expect that Kim will do at least enough to keep it alive, and therefore I'm expecting in the next month still some surprises to come out of Pyongyang. If we do get to that point, is what I'm getting to. So if diplomacy survives, it's because North Korea actually starts to do something worth looking at and verifying. Then I worry that China really will relax sanctions. That's a much more serious problem. How do we maintain enough pressure and sanctions pressure, part of that, on North Korea when they are actually taking a few steps toward denuclearization? And the flip side of that is if it falls apart and we have to reimpose more maximum pressure, plus, where will China be? And for me there, the first question though is where will South Korea be? I don't want to see a rupture between Washington and Seoul on this issue. So we face some bigger questions, frankly, than the China sanctions question. There's no doubt though, just going back to your basic question, that intensified trade friction has not helped and not encouraged China to play ball with us on sanctions, but for their own reasons, they've continued to enforce most of them.
Just a very quick comment on top of what Patrick has said. I'm seeing a divergence between, on the one hand, countries like Japan, Australia, and most parts of the American administration who want to maintain close to a maximum pressure campaign in order to get, where they want to get to. And on the other hand, you have countries like South Korea, China, and Russia advocating for an almost normalization of relations in order to get to where they want to get to. So I think that's a serious problem when South Korea particularly is in disagreement with a lot of the American allies and with much of the administration itself. Now, I don't put all the blame on South Korea in the sense that I think the American administration still has to, in terms of ally management, still has to be clearer to the allies how they want to play this and where they want to get to. So I'll speak from the Australian point of view. The Australian point of view, and it's my personal point of view as well, was that we supported the maximum pressure campaign because it got China to recalculate and North Korea to recalculate. We got to the Singapore summit and we were deeply disappointed with what came out of it. And not just because not a lot seemed to come out of it in terms of tangible obligations or even steps, but that it was just unclear where the endpoint actually was, and there didn't even seem to be agreement between North Korea, the United States, and other countries on what that endpoint was. But to support Patrick's comment that in the next couple of months, this sort of comes to a head. If this summit between Kim and Trump occurs, and nothing comes out of that, I do actually think you may see quite a divergence, like an even greater divergence between what the South Koreans want and what allies and possibly America will want, which is a hyped up maximum pressure campaign. I'm not quite sure South Korea is ready to go back to a maximum pressure campaign. So I think the next couple of months will be quite important.
Sir, in the third row here.
Hello, Robert Sheretta. I'm president of International Investor. We look at the world through an economic and financial prism, and we've seen a fundamental shift in a number of these countries over the last 2 decades. We see the business communities of each one of these nations mentioned as already having made a decision, and the decision is for China. Every one of these nations, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Australia, already trades more with China than they do with us. So while the political or the diplomatic politeness here in Washington might be that they will remain our steadfast allies forever, the reality is that the business communities in these nations and the governments themselves are going to be under increasing pressure to supply jobs and a growing economy for their nations. And that's already saying the future is China, not the U.S.
Amy? John?
Yeah.
I'll let Amy go first.
Look, there is definitely a perception in many countries that China is the economic future, and they've been looking for decades, as you said, to hitch their economic wagon to China to promote their supply chains, climb up the value-added ladder in manufacturing and other industries. But just a couple of points. First is sometimes the perception that China is the only large, important economic partner is belied by some of the facts. So trade relations, absolutely. Countries trade more with China for the most part than other countries in the region. But investment is still largely coming from the United States and other countries. China is still not the largest investor in those countries, which is a point that the Trump administration and previously the Obama administration, tried to make. It's a hard point to make because investment comes in, through the private sector and is not waving an American flag or, European flag or whatever. And so it's a little less visible sometimes than some of the trade statistics that are very visible. But they are important. And even in things like infrastructure support, infrastructure financing, Japan remains a larger player than China in many of the countries in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. China's catching up, but Japan remains quite out ahead. It's really the United States that's the lagging player in terms of government-supported sort of infrastructure. So I think you do have to take the whole picture into account. And that's why a lot of countries, and the United States and U.S. businesses bring a lot of things to the table that Chinese businesses don't bring. So having that investment from U.S. and other companies from other countries remains really important because of the quality of jobs and local participation that they often include, the way, the kinds of things that they learn from those businesses. So we hear that when we're out in the region all the time, how much they appreciate having relationships with U.S. businesses. And that's why countries in the region supported so much the idea of the United States leading the effort in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Even countries that were not members of the TPP, countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Taiwan, at some level, many in the business community and many in the government really supported the idea that the United States was deeply engaged in this effort, was working to raise the level of rules in the region, and would be the leader of economic architecture, emerging economic architecture, that the United States would be the leader and not China. So, the fact the United States stepped away from TPP, I think, is a tremendous blow to U.S. credibility, and I think it really did help move the narrative in that direction of, well, if the United States is not there wanting to take up the mantle of economic leadership, then China probably will be the economic leader in the region. I hope we can kind of claw our way back on that discussion.
I guess since now I work for a think tank and not a government, I can be blunt and honest. Look, I think business communities and business people determine their views based on whether they're making money. And what I mean by that is you look at the American business community 10 years ago. They were making money or thought they would make lots of money in China. What has soured is that they're not making money and getting IP stolen. And so the business community is at least split on China compared to 10 years ago, where on the whole, they were very supportive of softer policies in China. You take my country, Australia, our business community is extremely, I can call it pro-China. It's because if you look at our economic interactions, we sell commodities, agricultural goods, and when you sell commodities, agricultural goods, you don't really have to deal with the Chinese system. You just sell them stuff. And we sell tourism and education where the Chinese come to our country. My point is that for us, for the Australian business community, they're winning. And hence, nothing is being stolen, or very little is being stolen in terms of IP. They're not butting heads with the Chinese system, so they tend to be very pro-Chinese. Now, if that changes, then I expect them to change. Now, take Southeast Asia, and I'm Malaysian by background, but now Australian. I come from a very large Malaysian business family, my extended family. And I often ask them, and they have lots of investments in China. They've now pulled the investments out of China because they can't make money, but they sell stuff they produce in other countries to China. The point I'm making is that 5 years ago, when they were still investing in China with very big plans, they just didn't want any strategic security issues to disrupt the relationship. Now, because they're largely out of China but still sell stuff to China, to be frank, they couldn't care less what their government does on the security front as long as they can still sell stuff to China. So the point I'm trying to make is that I wouldn't actually say that these business communities in Southeast Asia, and I agree with Amy that ultimately trade and business is king. I wouldn't say these business communities have really chosen China. It's just that they just don't want disruption right now. But I think that the disputes China has with the United States and other countries increasingly is so deep and so structural that disruption will come. And, business people will sort of have their voice. They will always want to tone down disruption to their revenue flows, right? That's what business people do. I'm not being critical. That's just what they do. But I wouldn't phrase it as that they have essentially chosen China. I don't think that's actually true.
Eric, can I just make a few quick points? I mean, as China's footprint grows in Southeast Asia, there's a growing resistance and search for diversity. So it's not a linear path. Secondly, China's mostly focused on G to G, government to government. It does not do business to business well, as a general rule. Most countries in Southeast Asia want U.S. businesses. My understanding is that most American businesses don't understand how to get engaged in Southeast Asia. They need help. That's why we need to pool together the risk insurance from the BUILD Act, along with almost a sovereign wealth fund or something that give them the equity fund that they need to make those investments happen, because there's great opportunity. Again, let me just take Indonesia. This is a country that in 3 decades will be the 5th largest economy in the world. So this in itself, forget about the rest of Southeast Asia, just take Indonesia. 60% of the population is under 40 years of age. And that's a demographic you see throughout most of Southeast Asia, by the way. Young, youthful, vibrant. They haven't made up their minds about the future. We have a tremendous opportunity. We have also business sectors that they don't really want from China. Our high-tech industry still is something that is highly vaunted in terms of sought out, and they want that high technology. They want our human capacity, our educational capital, our training and education. They want energy in some cases, LNG or alternative technologies for energy. So there are tremendous opportunities for this. So yes, China's footprint grows, but ours can also get stronger. That's the point. And I think Amy made a very good point. Although we don't want to make it look like there's a division of labor going on to contain China, we can mobilize allies and partners on top of our areas of investment and vice versa, but we can have an even bigger impact. So if you take about the Lower Mekong Initiative, and tie that into what Japan's doing, and pooling these investments to be bigger than the individual parts, there's tremendous opportunity there too.
Yeah, enormous. Ma'am, in the front row.
Jennifer Zheng from the Epoch Times. I have 2 questions. One is a little bit follow-up with what we were discussing. So how do you think the trade war between the US and China is affecting Southeast Asian countries? Has it changed their perspective about they have to rely on China for economically? So the question is, Mrs. Searight mentioned that U.S. is not doing enough comparing to what China is doing with their Belt and Road Initiative. So what should U.S. do maybe to do more in this area and to let this country feel they have more support from the U.S. side? Thank you.
John, can you take the first question?
Sure. Trade war in Southeast Asia, at the moment, the simple answer is they want to stay out of it, right? And in fact, some of them are actually benefiting from, well, part of a trade war, intentionally and unintentionally, countries, because they're getting worried about the US-China trade war, if they can, they're moving supply chains elsewhere. I mean, that was already happening anyway because of high Chinese labour costs, etc. But they're moving it to other countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc. So some of the Southeast Asian countries are actually benefiting, but the immediate answer is that they want to keep out of it. I think in a longer term, look, there is still a lack of clarity from Southeast Asian countries, and I think indeed from US allies, about what the trade war is about, because I think the administration is still divided, right? And this is my personal feeling from afar, I have no inside information. But you have some characters in the administration where it is about divorcing critical supply chains from China. For other parts of administration, particularly within the White House, it is just about budget deficits. For other parts of administration, it's about targeting key sectors, particularly high advanced technology sectors, and ensuring that China doesn't get the capacity to move ahead of America and dominate those industries. But I don't think there is a consensus within this administration. Now, certainly, if the trade was just about reducing deficits, I don't think any country, including Australia, could really support that as a reason for a trade war. But if it's about things like IP theft, ensuring that China doesn't create closed ecosystems in invaluable sectors of the future, then I think they can support that. So I think it's too early to say, because we still don't know what this trade war is about. But in the short term, they just want to stay out of it. And if they can benefit, which some of them are, they will.
To answer your question, what can the United States do more of to counter China's Belt and Road? We've talked a little bit about it already. Some of the announcements that have been made, I think, are very good steps. Congress passing the BUILD Act, which in effect doubles OPIC's resources. It would be great to reauthorize the Exim Bank and double their resources. It is terrific that we are starting early steps in coordinating some development finance with our key partners in the region, Japan and Australia. These are all very positive steps. However, I think we have to be realistic that in the end, these are still going to be largely marginal in the big scheme of things. The United States does not do government-led infrastructure. It certainly doesn't do it. It hasn't done it in a long time. The United States has been out of the business of building roads and bridges and ports, decades ago. This is not the comparative advantage, so to speak, of the United States. Private sector-led investment, including in infrastructure and in soft infrastructure in areas like technology, that is an area where U.S. businesses do very well. And so to the extent that the government can find ways to step up and support business activities in the way that I've talked about, Patrick has talked about, these are all positive steps, but they're not really game changers when you're up against such a huge game that China is playing. So what the United States really should do is focus on what the United States is really good at. And what is the United States good at, and what is most appreciated about the United States in the region? It's the ability for the United States to lead other countries, to create rules of the game in trade that are really positive, really bring countries, create more dynamic, open, prosperous economies. Yes, a lot of the rules do benefit U.S. businesses, but over the long run, they benefit those countries in the region, which there are a lot of tremendous spillover effects. The United States has abilities to get partners in the room and really push for high standards, high rules, harmonizing certain policies, attacking non-tariff barriers, in finding ways to enforce the agreements that were reached over time so that countries live up to the obligations that they committed to in ways that really have beneficial effects, often for the countries themselves. They're politically difficult things to do. So when Vietnam signed up for TPP, when the United States was leading the negotiations, it agreed to rules that changed their labor markets, changed their labor regulations so that labor now would be free to organize into unions. That's a tremendously positive step for a country like Vietnam. Now there's concern that those rules won't be enforced, those obligations won't be enforced because the United States is no longer in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the United States should be engaged in the area that it's good at, that's very mutually beneficial for the United States and other countries in the region, which is focusing on trade rules in a multilateral or collective setting. And right now, the U.S. trade officials are just not there. They're working on bilateral deals, they're doing other things, but they're attacking the WTO. They're doing a lot of things that, in my view, are counterproductive in the long term.
I agree. Sir, here in the second row.
Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine. A couple of you have made the notation that the countries in Southeast Asia want economic ties basically with both, but they're looking for diplomatic security ties with the United States. The question is, is the United States meeting its obligation in that part? We haven't really seen an increase in our participation, military participation in the Far East as a whole, particularly in Southeast Asia. We haven't renewed the LCS ships in Singapore. Yeah. They keep talking about it. We haven't had a carrier in the area except recently. And other than the FONOPs, which have been a step up under Trump, I haven't really seen any major increase in U.S. military buildup in the area. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, let me start. Yes, I agree with your analysis that, first of all, countries in the region, most of them, very much welcome more security cooperation with the United States. They have various political sensitivities around defense cooperation, and so it's a question of whether it's the Obama administration or the Trump administration, it's very much a question of working with countries where the door is open to doing more and moving at a pace that your partner country is comfortable with. And that equation changes over time, over different leadership and other things. So for example, when I was in the Obama administration, I was working with the Philippines on negotiating the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement and the implementation, the early implementation of agreeing on locations for what we call the EDCA. But then President Duterte was elected and he made it clear he wasn't a big fan of the EDCA, and although he agreed to abide by the treaty and the agreement in a narrow sense, he sort of slowed down the implementation of that agreement. That's not the Trump administration's fault, it's just the leadership of the Philippines. When you look at countries like Vietnam and India, there's been a real openness to moving more and more forward with more and more defense cooperation, which in both cases is really historic. However, the pace is going to be moderate, going to be slow to moderate at best. And I think both administrations have worked very hard to try to push that defense cooperation as far as it will go, given the kind of political sensitivities that still exist in those countries. So in general, I think both administrations and administrations prior to that have been focused on, stepping up our cooperation with some key allies and emerging partners in the region. But I agree with your analysis that despite this talk about all of the increased resources for the Pentagon under the Trump administration, there's very little evidence that more resources are flowing to the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific or Southeast Asia in particular. There are not, there was an announcement about increased foreign military financing that Secretary Pompeo announced, an additional $300 million. It's not clear what time frame that is, by the way, but that's significant. That's important. We'll take that. But there is not, in terms of other bilateral or multilateral programs, the Maritime Security Initiative, there has not been a step up in funding. If anything, it's kind of flattened out and is kind of trending downward. So I think there's perhaps a bit of a misperception that because the Pentagon has gotten more resources allocated to it, a lot of that is flowing into the Indo-Pacific strategy. If it is, I'm not seeing it, but maybe it's there and I just haven't seen it yet. The FONOPs, I do also agree, is a very positive step that the Trump administration took to create a much more kind of clearly articulated and regularly executed, FONOPs being conducted on a very regular basis. I think that's a positive step, but that is not the same thing as pouring a lot of resources into defense cooperation.
Patrick, to you.
Sure. Well, again, two problems that we face. One of them is our own strength of our defense, our Navy, for instance. I mean, the fact that we're still at only 286 ships, we need more ships. So we saw Admiral Davidson this last week talk about, in fact, at Halifax, maybe you were with him, John, talk about the need to maybe divest the missile defense issue more to ashore rather than at sea, so we can free up ships for a mission as we try to build a bigger Navy. But then, even if we had a bigger Navy, the second problem is in Southeast Asia, they're very wary about provoking the Chinese. So even our ally, putative ally, Rodrigo Duterte, this week, as he's getting ready to host, as he's now hosting Xi Jinping, floated the idea that maybe the United States should stop its military exercises. Well, of course, we're not going to stop our military exercises. In fact, we just increased them with the Philippines. He just agreed to them. But other countries like Vietnam just hosted more Navy ship visits in the last couple of months than they have in years. I mean, and so it wasn't just the Japanese helicopter carrier went in, that allowed the American aircraft carrier to go in, but you had the Europeans there, you had everybody there. The more navies, the more countries we can have show up and cooperate with Southeast Asian countries, the better. It'll help embed the American presence in a more collective effort, which I think is necessary. But there is no substitute for the geography, frankly, of the Philippines and Vietnam, and Singapore, in Malaysia and Indonesia, in sort of making sure that we have a strong presence in the first island chain and defense there. It's very important for us to stay there and to build that. I think we can, with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, keep making progress quietly, notwithstanding Duterte never wanting to give us face or credit publicly. But in the administration of the Philippines, there's strong support for even the U.S.-Philippine alliance. We need to take it into the 21st century. We need to build the security cooperation that the Vietnamese want with the United States. We need to take the opening we have under Prime Minister Mahathir in Malaysia now that we didn't have under the corrupt government of Prime Minister Najib. We need to take advantage of the fact that our ambassador, Joe Donovan, in Jakarta just flew to the Natuna Islands, a very controversial move, but here's the first American ambassador to go out and essentially indirectly show that there's American support for the Natuna Islands in Indonesian hands, as even the Chinese claim they're not disputing, but they're pushing Indonesia around, and they would if they could. So there are a lot of different things that we can do politically and militarily to strengthen our security posture at home and in the region. Resources are tight. This isn't just a Democratic Republican thing. It's the reality is these are expensive systems, legacy systems, really expensive. We need to reform as well. We need to find smarter ways to build lethal things that can be in more places.
Ma'am, here in the second row.
Thank you. Thanks for the panel. My name is Li Yang. We talk about a lot of principles and economic competition, and I want to, based on this concept, trace out our history. I think there's a time that American probably want China to have a cultural revolution, but after that, probably 50 years later, China, they are not celebrating cultural revolution.
Yeah.
And so by that, I want to see the comparison of the United States. In the United States, they don't celebrate or say let's learn something from Confucius' teachings. And it's very difficult to find something literature in the library. And in fact, especially recently, they want to sort of control Confucius' teaching.
Ma'am, if you could shorten just...
Right. My question is right there, principle. Are we talking about a right principle, or are we talking about just a fake choice? The Republican, they could label everything they want as principle.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Second is we are talking competition. Competition have a meaning if you are saying based on a better choice, equipment, or better wisdom to do something right. But in the United States, they practically label everybody, opponents are enemy or failure or inferior. So I just wonder, would you be based on these two concepts, especially now,
Thank you.
the PPP, both China and United States choose PPP. But because China is the government oriented, by United States, there's a base subsidized private. There's totally different direction.
Thank you. Yeah, your question about principles is absolutely important, and I think goes directly to something that John had spoken about earlier.
Well, I think Amy raised it as well. I mean, you know, the principles, if you look at the principles that I think the United States, whether this administration or previous one, and its allies are promoting, they are not inherently Western or Republican principles. They're effectively principles that say to whichever state that you have the right to make your own decisions, you have the right to negotiate your economic and other agreements fairly and openly without coercion, and that when you do negotiate agreements, they do not bind you in a way that restrict the sort of rights and privileges that nations have to make decisions for themselves. So, in one word, principles that uphold the sovereignty of decision-making are free from coercion by any country. And this can be applied equally against the United States or China. They are not inherently Western or Republican or democratic principles. The Chinese do often use this notion of Confucianism as an alternative worldview. First of all, I don't really, being from a Chinese background, I don't really even understand what that means. Right. Secondly, what I interpret it to mean is that you're talking about a set of principles that emphasises sovereign equality, whereas countries have the right to choose their own, make their own decisions, versus a worldview where it's hierarchical, whereas the bigger the country it is and the greater the civilization of that country, the more rights and privileges that country has over another country. So from I think the Australian or American or Japanese or South Korean point of view, a country like New Zealand with 3 million people has exactly the same rights as a country as the United States or China. From China's point of view, a country with 3 million people doesn't have the same rights as a country with 1.4 billion people. I think that's ultimately the difference there between the two sides.
Ma'am, here in the front row.
Thank you. I'm Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Would you discuss the role of Vietnam in ASEAN centrality, and in the balance of strategic rivalry between US and China in the Indo-Pacific Ocean? Recently, Vietnam has opened arms to Russia, had a visit with Russia, and there's increasing relationship with Russia. Also, recently, the ambassador of Vietnam in India had declined the cooperation with the US, India, Japan, Australia coalition, military coalition in Southeast Asia or in the East Sea of Vietnam. How do you take that as implications for the big picture?
Thank you. And Amy, would you like
to? You want to go? Okay. Look, I mean, just for Vietnam generally, you know, Vietnam's a sort of strange country for the United States and Australia because on the one hand, it is not a democratic country. You know, it does not share our political values and even some of our civil society values. But on the other hand, it's probably the pluckiest country in Southeast Asia. It is the country with a very bloody history with China, as we know. And actually, it's a country, in my view, that's most prepared to take on China to defend its own interests through force or other means. So I think, you know, from that point of view, I think we have a sort of two-tracked approach to Vietnam, and that is one, yes, we would like to see greater development of democratic institutions and civil society and political reform, but the other track is, you know, the Vietnamese are damn good strategic partners, and we're going to take as much advantage of that as we can. So I think that's a general viewpoint. But
yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Just to add, you know, within ASEAN, Vietnam is in an interesting position. It's one of the newer ASEAN members, but it is a claimant state with a lot of disagreements over territorial disputes with China. And I think it was in a very comfortable position when the Philippines was out in front of the other ASEAN members, arguing within ASEAN, within the ASEAN family, making the case that ASEAN should take a very strong stand against a unified stand vis-a-vis China on resolving or managing the disputes in the South China Sea. And this goes back to the early 1990s when they first approached China with the idea of doing a declaration of conduct and then to negotiate a code of conduct. And the Philippines was pushing very hard for a unified position within ASEAN. That, of course, continued up until the Aquino administration when they took the case to the arbitral tribunal in The Hague and got a very favorable resolution. But then Duterte was elected and he's walked away from that ruling. And the Philippines has walked away in general from leading the charge to have ASEAN unity in the face of Chinese coercion. That has left Vietnam in a very uncomfortable position because Vietnam is not comfortable really being out in front, pushing harder than the Philippines, the traditional champion of these issues. And so it's felt very isolated. And as John mentioned, and I agree with, I do think there's some risk to ASEAN unity and ASEAN relevance. If ASEAN remains very divided on these issues, I think Vietnam is going to increasingly look for other diplomatic and security vehicles to promote its vision for, and its objectives for what it wants to see in terms of balancing against China. But Vietnam has made a strategic choice and an economic choice by throwing in with the TPP and engaging not only with the United States, but with many other countries to strengthen their security cooperation, their defense cooperation. I think they're looking for a lot of ways to balance against China. They've had a very long relationship with Russia in terms of defense cooperation and diplomatic cooperation. And so it's not realistic to think they would turn their back on Russia. It makes sense for them to maintain a close relationship. They have a lot of Russian armaments and systems that they need to continue to utilize and integrate into other systems. So it makes sense, just like India has as well, that they maintain a relationship with Russia. But I think they're looking in a very flexible way about how to find a variety of vehicles to balance against China and to promote a kind of future regional order that they'll feel safe and secure in.
And just briefly, so I was just in Da Nang for the 10th annual South China Sea Conference, and watching the Vietnamese on the stage, forget about the international actors outside of Vietnam, I've seen over the 10 years a maturity, a sophistication grow. So the Vietnamese, and this is the Diplomatic Academy, is the main backer of this, but you've seen them increasingly become sophisticated advocates for Vietnamese position. That's point one. Second point, for my trip to Hanoi earlier last month, again, just so impressed with the youth of Vietnam. That's why I'm so happy to see something like the Fulbright University, Amy helped, establish down in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City. We can make so much about the future generations of engaging Vietnam. So they may not be a democracy today, but they may be, trending that way because for all the reasons John mentioned, we are natural allies with Vietnam in so many ways. And our businesses get it down there in the South. What the development in Da Nang is incredible. The youth population, I mean, this is a city of 10 million with 8 million scooters. It's very vibrant. It's great.
Yeah, I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and we're out of it, but we have time for one last question. This woman in the second row.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lee mentioned that Cambodia and Laos are effectively client states of China. There have been reports that China wants to build a naval base in Cambodia, but the Cambodian Prime Minister just said that that's not happening. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Cambodia. And if I may add, the Asia Times recently reported that, wrote an article saying that Cambodia is really at the center of a new Cold War. So if Cambodia, why?
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Patrick or Amy who mentioned, but it's correct, and that is that China does government-to-government relations, and more precisely, they tend to do regime-to-regime relations, or even Beijing to individual leader relations, and that's kind of what they've done with Cambodia and Laos. But you go around Cambodia and Laos, there is no love for China. I mean, first of all, they don't want to be part of any great power rivalry. They don't want to be caught in the middle. Secondly, I think Amy mentioned that they are next to China, so they understand that they need to live with this big giant. But there is no love for China at the sort of societal or even sort of at the bureaucratic level. So I think at the top levels, China will be able to get concessions like favorable statements, favorable top-level statements on issues, or concessions like the use of Cambodia and Laos to block unanimous ASEAN statements condemning China and South China Sea. China can achieve that pretty easily. But to actually sort of achieve on-the-ground infrastructure of meaning and value, I think it is more difficult. And I think that's just where relations are at the moment.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists. It was a really exceptionally useful and informative discussion. I hope that you will all come back and we can continue this conversation more. This is just the opening round, as they say. Thank you all.
Thank you.
There.
Thank you.
Good job.